My name is Marcus. I'm 42 years old, and for 15 long, grueling years, my classic car restoration shop was the beating, grease-stained heart of the West End. That is, until a massive corporate takeover swept through our streets and turned the neighbors I'd known for 10 years into greedy, unrecognizable strangers. They tried to drive me out of the community I'd helped build. But on that freezing, rain-soaked Tuesday night, they didn't know I'd pull over to help a stranger stranded on the darkest stretch of the county road. That night, I didn't just give him a ride. Before I tell you my story, I ask that you watch this story through to the end out of respect for Black people. Translated with deepl.com, free version. The rain did not simply fall that evening. It assaulted the windshield of my vintage Chevelle in heavy, relentless sheets. The rhythmic thud-thud, thud-thud of the wiper blades felt like the heavy beating of a tired heart, struggling to keep visibility alive in the suffocating darkness. The dashboard cast a low amber glow over my knuckles, which were still stained with the stubborn shadow of motor oil. I gripped the leather steering wheel tightly, my jaw clenched so hard a dull ache radiated up to my temples. I was driving nowhere in particular, just letting the engine's deep, steady rumble drown out the chaotic noise in my head. The atmosphere in the neighborhood had become completely unbreathable. Earlier that afternoon, I had walked to the local diner, a place where I used to have my morning coffee greeted by warm smiles. Today, the room had gone entirely silent the moment the bell above the door chimed. Mrs. Gable, a woman whose alternator I had replaced just a month prior, sharply pulled her purse closer to her chest and looked away, whispering something to the man beside her. The collective glare of the room was heavy, thick with a resentment they didn't even try to hide. They had all signed the developer's initial purchase agreements. They were all waiting for their payouts. And I, holding the anchor property, was the only thing standing between them and their sudden windfall. But it wasn't just the neighbor's betrayal that sat heavy in my chest. It was the suffocating, insidious way the development firm was trying to force my hand. Just yesterday, their lead acquisition agent, a slick man named Caldwell, had stepped into my garage. He hadn't bothered to wipe his expensive leather shoes on the mat. He stood amidst my tools, refusing to make direct eye contact, choosing instead to examine his manicured fingernails. When he handed me the lowball offer, 20% less than market value, he had smiled a tight, entirely patronizing smile. He had spoken slowly, overpronouncing every syllable. "Look, Marcus. A lump sum like this, it is a lot to manage for someone with your background. Take the cash. Move out to the suburbs. Find a place more fitting for your demographic. Don't make this difficult." He hadn't used a single slur, but the venom was there, coated in corporate pleasantries. The distinct implication that I was out of my depth, that I didn't belong in a high-stakes negotiation, purely because of the skin I lived in. The tires of my car hissed over the slick asphalt, kicking up an arc of dirty water. The county road was practically abandoned, flanked by dense, swaying pines that looked like black silhouettes against the stormy night sky. As I rounded a sharp bend, a flash of metallic silver caught the sweep of my headlights. A few hundred yards ahead, a luxury SUV, the kind that cost more than most people's first homes, sat crippled on the shoulder. Its hazard lights pulsed with a desperate, rhythmic urgency, casting orange halos in the torrential downpour. Standing right beside the front grille was a man. He wasn't waving his arms. He wasn't pacing. He was just standing there, an expensive charcoal overcoat plastered to his shoulders, the rain matting his silver-flecked hair to his forehead. I eased my foot off the accelerator. My instinct, honed by weeks of feeling hunted in my own town, told me to keep driving. The world had shown me no kindness lately. Why should I extend it? But as the headlights washed over him, I saw the quiet, rigid dignity in his posture. He looked utterly defeated, yet entirely composed. I pulled the Chevelle onto the shoulder, the gravel crunching loudly beneath my tires, and threw the shifter into park. Reaching across the bench seat, I rolled down the passenger window. The icy wind howled into the warm cabin, bringing with it the sharp scent of wet asphalt and pine. The man slowly turned his head. Water dripped from his brow, catching the light of the dashboard. He approached the window with measured steps. "Get in," I commanded, my voice flat, leaving no room for debate. He didn't hesitate. He opened the heavy door and slid onto the vinyl seat, bringing the biting cold of the storm in with him. The door slammed shut with a heavy, metallic thud, instantly cutting off the roar of the storm outside. The sudden quiet inside the cabin was deafening, save for the persistent drum of rain on the steel roof. The man sat perfectly still, his hands resting on his knees. He smelled of damp, high-end wool, a hint of cedar, and the metallic tang of rainwater. He didn't offer a frantic stream of gratitude. He didn't explain what had happened to his vehicle. He just stared straight ahead through the water-streaked glass, a complex geometry of exhaustion etched into the lines around his eyes. I didn't press him. I simply put the car back into drive and pulled smoothly out onto the dark, winding road. We rode in total, profound silence. It was the kind of quiet that spoke volumes, a shared understanding between two men who had completely exhausted their tolerance for the world's noise. I didn't know his name, and he didn't know mine. All I knew was the steady rhythm of the wipers, the glow of the dashboard, and the strange, undeniable shift in the atmosphere of my car. The board was setting itself up in the dark, and neither of us realized we were about to play the most important game of our lives. The remainder of the drive that night was entirely devoid of conversation, yet it was the loudest silence I had ever experienced. The heavy downpour continued to batter the roof of my Chevelle, but inside the cabin, the atmosphere was thick with a strange, unspoken gravity. I navigated the winding roads toward the city's affluent epicenter, the glittering high-rises slowly piercing through the storm clouds. I finally pulled into the grand, illuminated semicircle of the Grandview Hotel, a place where a single night's stay cost more than a month's rent at my shop. The valet attendants, clad in pristine uniforms, froze as my loud, exhaust-heavy vintage muscle car rumbled to a halt under their crystal chandelier awning. The man beside me didn't rush. He unbuckled his seatbelt with deliberate slowness, turned his head, and looked at me. There was no condescension in his eyes, no performative gratitude. He simply offered a singular curt nod, stepped out into the damp night air, and vanished through the revolving brass doors. I put the car in gear and drove back into the dark, dismissing the encounter as nothing more than a bizarre footnote to a miserable week. I was wrong. The real nightmare was waiting for me the following morning. The storm had passed, leaving behind a suffocating, humid heat that baked the asphalt and made the air feel heavy in my lungs. When I pulled up to my garage at 7 in the morning, the usual tranquility of my routine was immediately shattered. My shop, a weathered brick building with deep roots and a soul built on honest labor, sat on a prime corner lot. Today, however, it felt like an island under siege. I unlocked the heavy steel padlocks on the roll-up doors, the familiar, comforting smell of motor oil and aged leather washing over me. I tried to focus on a 1968 Mustang that needed a carburetor rebuilt, but the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I could feel them before I saw them. By 9 o'clock, the sidewalk across the street had become a staging ground. It started with just 3 people, Mrs. Gable, flanked by 2 men from the local homeowners association. They were standing there, arms crossed, staring directly at my open garage bays. Within an hour, the crowd swelled to over 24 neighbors. These were people whose tires I had patched for free when they were down on their luck. People whose kids waved at me every afternoon. Now, their faces were twisted into ugly, unfamiliar masks of greed and entitlement. They had all been promised a golden ticket by the development firm, a massive payout that would double their property values overnight, but only if the entire block was sold. My shop was the cornerstone. Without my land, the deal would collapse. They began to cross the street, their collective footsteps sounding like a slow, deliberate drumbeat on the pavement. The mob mentality is a fascinating, terrifying thing. Individually, they were cowards, hiding their prejudices behind polite neighborly smiles. But together, fueled by the intoxicating promise of unearned wealth, they shed their civility entirely. They stopped just at the edge of my property line, a physical barrier they were suddenly itching to cross. Then a sleek, black corporate sedan rolled to a stop at the curb. Caldwell, the lead acquisition agent, stepped out. He was dressed in a sharp light gray suit, completely unbothered by the stifling humidity. He didn't approach my garage. Instead, he leaned casually against the hood of his car, crossing his ankles, a smug, venomous smile playing on his lips. He was orchestrating this. He had weaponized my neighbors against me, using their financial desperation as a battering ram to break my spirit. He took a slow sip from a plastic iced coffee cup, watching the show he had produced. "You need to sign the papers, Marcus," a voice barked from the crowd. It was Greg, a man who still owed me $300 for a brake job. He took a step forward, his face flushed red with artificial courage. "You're holding the whole neighborhood hostage. It's selfish. It's just a dirty garage. Take the money and go back to where you belong." The phrasing wasn't an accident. Go back to where you belong. The underlying message was painfully clear. They couldn't fathom that a black mechanic had outmaneuvered a massive corporate entity simply by holding his ground. To them, I wasn't a businessman protecting his hard-earned legacy. I was an ignorant obstacle, a stubborn mule too stupid to realize he was standing in the way of progress. "We're tired of this eyesore." Mrs. Gable chimed in, her voice shrill, her finger pointing violently toward my vintage neon sign. "You're ruining our futures. You have no right to do this to us." I picked up a heavy, steel lug wrench from my workbench and walked slowly to the edge of the open bay door. I didn't raise the tool in anger. I simply held it at my side, the cold metal grounding me. The crowd flinched, a collective gasp rippling through the front row. They expected me to snap. They wanted me to become the aggressive, dangerous stereotype they had already convinced themselves I was. If I yelled, if I threatened them, Caldwell would have the police here in 3 minutes, and my leverage would be gone forever. I stood in absolute silence. I looked Mrs. Gable dead in the eyes until she nervously looked away, adjusting her cardigan. I shifted my gaze to Greg, whose chest suddenly deflated under the weight of his own cowardice. Finally, I looked past the angry mob, locking eyes with Caldwell, who was still leaning against his pristine sedan. His smug smile faltered for a fraction of a second. I didn't need to speak. The architecture of their intimidation was crumbling against my refusal to play the role they had assigned me. The tension in the air was so thick it felt combustible, a powder keg waiting for a single spark. And just as Greg stepped forward, raising his fist to escalate the confrontation from verbal abuse to physical violence, the deep, guttural roar of high-powered engines echoed down the block. The ground itself began to vibrate. The deep, guttural roar that interrupted the standoff wasn't the police. It was the sound of heavy, armored luxury. 4 massive, jet-black SUVs with heavily tinted windows turned the corner onto my street in perfect, intimidating synchronization. They didn't just drive down the block, they claimed it. The lead vehicle swerved sharply toward the curb, forcing the aggressive mob of my neighbors to scatter backward onto the hot asphalt like frightened pigeons. Greg, who had been seconds away from taking a swing at me, practically tripped over his own feet to get out of the way, his artificial courage evaporating instantly. The vehicles formed a solid, impenetrable barricade between my garage and the street, their engines idling with a low, menacing hum. If you are watching this and you've ever had to work twice as hard just to get half the respect, hit that subscribe button and leave a comment on the video. Because this story is about what happens when you stop being polite and start keeping receipts. Stay with me. I didn't move an inch. I kept the heavy steel lug wrench relaxed at my side, my eyes fixed on the spectacle unfolding in front of me. The first person to break the stunned silence wasn't a neighbor, but Caldwell, the arrogant acquisition agent. The smug, venomous smile entirely vanished from his face, replaced by a sudden, chalky pallor. The plastic iced coffee cup slipped from his trembling fingers, hitting the pavement with a sharp crack, spilling brown liquid over his expensive leather shoes. He didn't even notice. He was staring in absolute terror at the rear passenger door of the lead SUV. A driver stepped out first, an imposing figure in a dark suit who quickly moved to open the back door. The man who emerged was not a stranger to me. It was the stranded driver from the pouring rain the night before. Gone was the soaking wet, exhausted man I had driven to the Grandview Hotel. Today, he was draped in a perfectly tailored, sharp navy suit that radiated quiet, absolute authority. He adjusted his cuffs, his silver-flecked hair catching the morning sun. He didn't look angry, he looked ruthlessly efficient. This was the man pulling the strings. This was the phantom billionaire whose corporation was trying to buy the entire neighborhood and erase my existence from this block. Caldwell practically tripped over himself rushing forward, his voice a frantic, high-pitched stammer. "Mr. Harrison, sir, we didn't expect you on the ground. I was just handling this final holdout. As you can see, the local demographic is being incredibly stubborn, but I assure you, I have it under control." Harrison didn't even look at his agent. He didn't acknowledge Caldwell's existence or his desperate, coded racism. He simply walked straight past him, leaving Caldwell mid-sentence with his hand outstretched in the humid air. The crowd of neighbors, who had just been screaming at me to sell my soul, fell completely silent, parting like the Red Sea as Harrison approached my property line. Mrs. Gable pulled her cardigan tight, her eyes darting nervously between me and the billionaire. Harrison stopped exactly where the mob had stopped, right at the edge of my concrete driveway. But unlike them, he didn't look at my shop with disgust. He looked at the vintage neon sign, the pristine tools meticulously organized on the walls, and the 1968 Mustang sitting in the bay. Then his sharp, gray eyes locked onto mine. "I make it a point to understand the assets I am trying to acquire," Harrison said, his voice calm, carrying effortlessly over the quiet hum of his convoy. "But my agents clearly failed to communicate the true value of this specific corner." Caldwell scrambled up behind him, sweating profusely, desperate to regain control of a narrative that had just slipped through his fingers. "Sir, it's just a dirty garage. It's an eyesore. We can easily push him out through the city zoning board." Harrison raised a single index finger. He didn't look back. He didn't shout. The tiny, silent gesture was a masterclass in raw power. Caldwell snapped his mouth shut so fast I heard his teeth click. I set the lug wrench down on my workbench. The metallic clink echoed loudly in the tense silence. I didn't smile, and I didn't show an ounce of relief. I realized in that split second that the board had just flipped. Yesterday, I was a mechanic fighting a faceless corporation. Today, I was the man who had shown humanity to the king when his own knights weren't around. But I wasn't going to rely on gratitude. I was going to leverage the reality of the situation. "Your agent has been trying to bully me out of a property I own free and clear, Mr. Harrison," I said, my voice steady, making sure every single neighbor heard me. "He brought a mob to my door because he assumed I didn't have the intellect to read a bad contract. But you and I both know that without my anchor lot, your entire multi-million-dollar development plan dies right here on this concrete." Harrison's lips twitched upward into the faintest hint of a smile. He saw exactly what I was doing. I wasn't asking for a favor based on last night's car ride. I was establishing myself as his equal at the negotiating table, right in front of the people who thought I was nothing. Harrison's faint smile didn't fade. It solidified into a mask of pure, calculating business acumen. He understood the architecture of leverage better than anyone, and he recognized instantly that I was holding the absolute master key to his empire's next expansion. He didn't see a stubborn mechanic standing in a dirty garage. He saw a man who had successfully cornered a billion-dollar equity firm without breaking a single sweat. Caldwell, however, was still desperately trying to cling to the fragile illusion of his own supremacy. He pushed himself off the hood of his sedan, his expensive shoes crunching loudly against the loose gravel of my driveway. "Mr. Harrison, please. You can't seriously be entertaining this. He is just a—" "Caldwell," Harrison interrupted, his voice dropping an octave, slicing through the humid morning air like a physical blade. "Your employment with my firm was predicated on your ability to secure this block quietly and efficiently. Instead, you have insulted the primary stakeholder, incited a public disturbance, and nearly derailed a $200 million project because of your own blinding incompetence." Caldwell's mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish suffocating on dry land. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving behind a sickly, mottled gray. "Hand over the development files," Harrison commanded, not even looking at the man anymore. "Then you can leave. You are officially terminated." The sheer finality of those words echoed against the weathered brick walls of my shop. Caldwell's hands shook so violently he could barely unlatch the brass clasps of his leather briefcase. He dropped a thick stack of heavy manila folders onto the hood of his car, turned, and walked away down the sidewalk. He didn't look back. The man who had strutted into my shop 24 hours earlier, dripping with unearned superiority and subtle racial venom, was now just a fired, humiliated pedestrian walking aimlessly into the blistering heat. But I wasn't finished. I turned my attention back to the crowd of neighbors. They were completely frozen, their eyes wide, watching their golden ticket evaporate into the heavy morning humidity. Mrs. Gable looked as though she might collapse, her hands trembling as she clutched her purse. Greg was staring intently at his own shoes, his face flushed dark red with a deeply uncomfortable realization. "My garage stays," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the psychological barrier they had tried to breach. "But it doesn't stay as a standalone property. I have spent the last 3 weeks reviewing the city's commercial zoning permits. I know that without this corner lot, your multi-story residential plan cannot legally secure the necessary street access for the underground parking." I looked directly at Harrison. "I don't want a standard buyout. I want a 15% equity stake in the entire West End development project. And I want the architectural plans amended to build around my shop, fully integrating it as a heritage commercial space on the ground floor." A collective gasp ripped through the crowd of neighbors. 15%. That didn't just make me a resident, that made me a primary partner. It made me, the black man they had just tried to physically intimidate and run out of town, their direct financial superior. Harrison stepped closer, invading the empty space between us to inspect me with a renewed, intense curiosity. He didn't scoff at the astronomical demand. He saw the cold, undeniable logic of it. 15% is steep for a corner lot, he murmured, his tone level, testing the waters. "It's extremely cheap for the key to the other 85%, I replied instantly, my gaze never wavering from his steel-gray eyes. Harrison let out a short, sharp exhale that might have been a laugh of genuine respect. He reached out and picked up the manila folders Caldwell had abandoned on the car hood. "You have 30 minutes to wash the grease off those hands, Marcus," he said, turning back toward the open door of his armored SUV. "We have a new contract to draft in my downtown office." As I walked back into the cool shadows of my garage to lock up, I paused and looked at the crowd one last time. They had wanted me gone because they thought I didn't belong in their wealthy, sanitized future. Now, they were going to spend the next decade paying rent and maintenance fees directly into a development fund that had my name permanently etched onto the board of directors. The silence on the street was absolute, heavy with the crushing, inescapable weight of their own monumental miscalculation. The air conditioning inside the Harrison Tower lobby was a sharp, biting contrast to the suffocating summer humidity of the West End. The floors were cut from seamless Italian marble, reflecting the cold, geometric lighting overhead. I walked through the towering glass doors wearing the same dark work jacket I had worn to open my garage that morning. My work boots, worn soft at the heels from years of standing on concrete, squeaked faintly against the pristine stone. The security guards, 2 men in tailored uniforms, immediately shifted their weight, their hands resting cautiously near their radios. They saw a black man in mechanic's clothes entering a billionaire's sanctuary, and their deeply ingrained conditioning immediately told them I was a threat, a trespasser, or a lost delivery driver. Before either of them could step forward to block my path, Harrison's personal assistant, a sharp woman in a fitted black dress, emerged from a private elevator and silently guided me past the security desk. The guards' faces went entirely slack as I bypassed the metal detectors and stepped into the private executive lift. The ride to the 52nd floor was silent, your ears popping as the city shrank into a miniature grid below. When the polished steel doors glided open, I stepped onto a plush, silver-gray carpet that silenced my footsteps entirely. We entered the main boardroom. It was a massive, intimidating space surrounded by floor-to-ceiling glass windows that offered a dizzying view of the skyline. Sitting at the far end of an imposing mahogany table was a team of 4 corporate lawyers. They were entirely identical in their presentation. Slick hair, $1,000 dark suits, and an unmistakable aura of unearned superiority. At the head of the table sat their lead counsel, a sharp-featured man named Vance. As I took my seat opposite him, Vance didn't bother to hide his distaste. He let out a slow, heavy sigh, the kind reserved for explaining basic manners to a difficult child, and delicately adjusted his gold cufflinks. Harrison walked into the room a moment later, holding a fresh cup of black coffee. He didn't sit down. He moved to the wide glass window, turning his back to the room, silently observing the city below. He was letting the board play out. He wanted to see if the mechanic he had invited to the table could actually survive the wolves. Vance pushed a heavy, leather-bound document across the glossy mahogany wood. It stopped exactly an inch from my hands. He tapped the top page with an expensive silver pen. "This is a very generous standard integration contract, Marcus," Vance said, dragging out my name with a syrupy, patronizing tone. "We've agreed to the 15% equity stake and the preservation of your garage. All you need to do is sign on the last page. I know legal documents can be quite overwhelming, so I've marked the signature line for you." He hadn't expected me to actually read it. People like Vance assumed my intelligence ended where the grease on my hands began. They relied on intimidation, hoping the sheer size of the room and the thickness of the paper would force a quick, blind surrender. I didn't pick up the pen. I opened the folder and slowly turned to page 34. I let the silence in the room stretch until it became a physical weight pressing down on the lawyer's shoulders. The ticking of the silver wall clock sounded like a hammer against an anvil. I traced my finger down a heavily worded paragraph buried in the middle of a section about property management. They had deliberately wrapped a poison pill in complicated legal phrasing, hoping I would skip over it. Stripped of its fancy words, the clause stated that if the new development fell below a certain profit margin in its first 2 years, the management board, meaning them, had the right to forcibly buy out my 15% share for pennies on the dollar. I looked up from the document, locking eyes with Vance. His smug, confident posture had stiffened slightly. "Section 4, paragraph B," I said, my voice completely flat, devoid of any emotional reaction. "A forced buyout contingency based on unverified profit margins." I picked up his expensive silver pen, clicked it, and drew a slow, deliberate black line entirely through the paragraph. The scratch of the ink against the thick paper was the only sound in the room. "I am not a tenant you can evict if the numbers don't look pretty, Vance. I am a foundational partner. This clause comes out or I go back downstairs, and your boss's $200 million project goes back to being a fantasy." Vance's face flushed a deep, ugly crimson. He opened his mouth to argue, to throw heavy legal jargon at me to put me back in my place. But before a single word could escape his lips, Harrison turned away from the window. "Rewrite it, Vance," Harrison commanded, his voice cold and hollow. "Exactly as he instructed. And do it now." The lead lawyer looked as though he had just swallowed glass. He snatched the document back across the table, his hands trembling with suppressed humiliation. I leaned back in the heavy leather chair, crossing my arms over my dark work jacket. The glass walls of the skyscraper gleamed in the afternoon sun. They had brought me up to the 52nd floor to trick me out of my legacy, only to realize I was the one who had written the rules of the game. The revised contract arrived exactly 12 minutes later. Harrison's assistant set it down on the mahogany table, the warm, distinct scent of fresh printer toner wafting up from the thick, premium paper. I didn't rush the moment. I slowly turned to page 34 and read the amended paragraph B. It was entirely clean. No linguistic traps, no hidden clauses, no poison pills. I reached into the breast pocket of my dark work jacket and pulled out my own pen, a simple, battered ballpoint I used to write out service tags. I pressed the tip to the final page and signed my name. The cheap blue ink flowed smoothly over the expensive corporate document, silently sealing a deal that reshaped the entire financial skyline of the city. Vance didn't say a single word. He pulled the heavy folder back toward his chest, his eyes fixed firmly on the glossy grain of the table, his prior arrogance entirely eradicated by the crushing weight of his own humiliation. Harrison stepped forward and extended his hand. It wasn't the obligatory limp handshake of corporate politics. It was a firm, grounding grip between two men who understood the raw, unforgiving mechanics of leverage. "I look forward to the groundbreaking ceremony, Marcus," Harrison said, his voice carrying a quiet, genuine weight that echoed in the cavernous boardroom. The descent in the glass elevator felt fundamentally different than the ride up. The sprawling city below was no longer an intimidating, glittering grid of wealth designed to exclude me. It was a massive architectural blueprint I had just successfully redrawn. When I stepped back out into the expansive, marble-floored lobby, the physical environment hadn't changed, but my power within it was absolute. The same two tailored security guards who had hovered nervously near their radios an hour prior now stood perfectly straight. They offered stiff, highly respectful nods as my worn boots squeaked across the stone floor. They didn't know the exact details of what had transpired on the 52nd floor, but they recognized the invisible, heavy aura of a man who had walked into the lion's den and returned holding the leash. I pushed through the heavy glass revolving doors into the sweltering afternoon heat, letting the chaotic, ambient noise of the city wash over me like an ovation. I drove the Chevelle back to the West End, the deep, rhythmic hum of the engine vibrating through the floorboards. The neighborhood was eerily quiet, practically suffocating under the heavy, stagnant summer humidity. The aggressive mob of neighbors from that morning had completely dispersed, retreating into their sanitized, air-conditioned living rooms to eagerly await news of their impending payouts. They undoubtedly thought they had won. They assumed the dramatic appearance of the billionaire's motorcade meant my stubborn resistance had finally been mercilessly crushed by corporate muscle. I pulled my car into the garage and reached up to grab the heavy steel chain of the roll-up door. The metallic crash as the door hit the concrete echoed loudly down the empty street, a sharp, definitive closing note to the most chaotic day of my life. The devastating reality of their miscalculation arrived on my street precisely at 8 o'clock the next morning. I was calmly wiping down my toolboxes when the heavy, low-end rumble of diesel engines shattered the suburban quiet. These were not sleek corporate sedans. They were massive, heavy-duty surveying trucks. They parked methodically along the entire perimeter of the block. A new project manager, a younger man who approached my open bay doors with a highly polite, deferential posture, unrolled massive architectural blueprints directly on the hood of his truck to show me the sightlines. Right across the street, front doors began to slowly open. Mrs. Gable stepped onto her porch, tightly clutching her morning tea, a wide, expectant smile spreading across her face. Greg walked out to his driveway, his chest puffed out with artificial pride, ready to gleefully watch the demolition of my shop. Instead, they watched in absolute confusion as the surveyor team began driving wooden stakes equipped with bright orange flags into the ground. The crew wasn't staking out a demolition zone. They were meticulously marking the boundaries of a massive, heavily reinforced protective barrier around my property line. Moments later, a heavy flatbed truck arrived, carrying an enormous, glossy aluminum project billboard. As a hydraulic crane lifted the heavy sign into place facing the street, the neighbors slowly gravitated toward the edge of their manicured lawns, their expectant smiles rapidly faltering. The towering billboard displayed a beautiful, three-dimensional rendering of the new West End development. And sitting right in the center of the sleek, multi-story glass architecture was my weathered, brick mechanics garage, proudly illuminated as the heritage commercial cornerstone of the entire project. Underneath the main corporate logo, in bold, undeniable silver letters, was a second line of text, in partnership with Marcus Holdings. I stood in the cool shadow of my open bay door and watched the blood drain entirely from Greg's face. Mrs. Gable's porcelain teacup rattled loudly against its saucer, her hands shaking violently as her mind struggled to process the crushing gravity of the image in front of her. The money they were promised would still come, but the fragile narrative of superiority they had built their pride upon was entirely shattered into dust. I wasn't the uneducated, stubborn obstacle they had tried to systematically bully and run out of their town. I was the architect of their immediate future, the executive partner whose name was permanently stamped on the very ground they would be forced to walk on every single day. Mrs. Gable looked across the street, her panicked eyes finally locking onto mine. She offered a small, pathetic, trembling smile, a desperate, transparent attempt to mend a bridge she had gleefully tried to burn just 24 hours ago. I didn't smile back. I didn't offer a nod of forgiveness. I simply turned my back to the street, picked up a heavy steel wrench, and walked back into the quiet dignity of my shop. The silence that fell over the neighborhood was absolute, heavy, and eternal. If this reminded you of a battle you had to win in silence, share this video, subscribe, and drop a comment below. I'll see you in the next story.